The fluorescent lights of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport cast harsh shadows across the polished marble floor as Camille Hartley approached the premium check-in counter. Each step in her pristine white Armani suit should have been a victory lap. After all, she was mere hours away from closing the largest tech merger in corporate history. Instead, an invisible weight pressed down on her shoulders, that familiar burden every successful person of color carries, the knowledge that no achievement ever fully shields you from the poison of prejudice. The morning had begun like any other. Camille had risen at 5 a.m. in her penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, following the same routine that had sustained her through 15 years of building Hartley Innovations from a basement startup into a $4.3 billion empire. Coffee first, always black, no sugar, then 30 minutes reviewing overnight communications from her teams across 3 continents. The merger documents were perfect, every clause scrutinized, every contingency planned. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came with high-stakes meetings. Not nervousness about the business. She'd proven her worth 1,000 times over. No, this was something deeper, more insidious. It was the exhaustion that came from knowing that in every boardroom, every conference room, every professional interaction, she would have to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition. She would have to be flawless, while others could be merely competent. She would have to smile through condescension and maintain grace under pressure that would break lesser souls. The airport bustled with early morning travelers, but Camille felt increasingly isolated as she wheeled her designer luggage toward the check-in area. Several passengers glanced her way with expressions she'd learned to decode over the years. Some showed recognition. Her face had graced Forbes and Fortune covers often enough. Others displayed that particular brand of confusion reserved for black women in expensive clothes, as if success and melanin were mutually exclusive. A middle-aged white man in a rumpled business suit nudged his companion, whispering something while staring directly at her. Camille's trained ear caught fragments. Affirmative action. Diversity hire. Probably doesn't even... The words hit like familiar slaps, each one carrying the weight of decades of similar whispers that had followed her through Ivy League halls, venture capital presentations, and industry conferences. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin with the practiced defiance born of countless such moments. This was the tax successful black women paid. The constant scrutiny, the assumption that their achievements were somehow unearned, the perpetual need to prove their legitimacy in spaces where mediocre white men were welcomed without question. At the premium counter, the shift in energy was palpable. Marissa Thompson, the blonde attendant whose name tag seemed to mock Camille, with its cheerful corporate font, looked up with an expression that managed to be both dismissive and hostile. In that microsecond, before any words were exchanged, Camille felt the familiar chill of recognition. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of professors who questioned her presence in advanced mathematics courses, in the faces of investors who assumed her white male co-founder must be the real brains behind the operation, in the expressions of board members who still, after all these years, seemed surprised when she demonstrated her expertise. "Good morning," Camille said, her voice carrying the polished professionalism that had become her armor. "I have a private flight scheduled for 7:30. The deliberate slowness of Marissa's response felt like psychological warfare. Each keystroke seemed designed to communicate that Camille's time, and by extension Camille herself, was of no particular importance. The raised eyebrow, the skeptical once-over the theatrical examination of her boarding documents, all were performed with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced such treatment herself. "Name?" Marissa asked, though the information was clearly displayed on her screen. "Camille Hartley." The words came out steady, but inside Camille felt a familiar fracturing. Part of her wanted to demand better treatment to invoke her status as a Fortune 500 CEO. Another part whispered the learned helplessness of childhood trauma. Maybe she didn't deserve better. Maybe she was taking up space that wasn't meant for her. The thoughts cascaded through her mind like a poisonous waterfall. How many times had she stood in similar situations her achievements questioned her presence, challenged the venture capital meeting where investors directed all questions to her white male co-founder despite her being the CEO. The board meeting where she was asked to fetch coffee for the real executives. The industry conference where she was assumed to be someone's assistant rather than the keynote speaker. Each memory was a fresh wound, a reminder that success was not armor against discrimination. The pain was not just emotional, but physical. A tightness in her chest, a tremor in her hands, that she fought to control a hollow sensation in her stomach that spoke to something deeper than nervousness. This was the pain of being perpetually othered, of having her humanity questioned at every turn. Hartley Innovations. Marissa's tone carried mockery disguised as clarification. That's unusual for this counter. The comment was a masterpiece of coded discrimination. Not explicitly racial, but loaded with assumptions about who belonged in premium services and who didn't. Camille had heard variations of this theme throughout her career. Are you sure you're in the right place? This is typically reserved for senior executives. There might be some confusion about your authorization. Each phrase was a small violence, a way of othering her without using overtly racist language. The cumulative effect was devastating. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one seemingly minor, but collectively crushing. Camille felt the familiar dissociation that came with racial trauma, part of her mind detaching to observe the scene from a safe distance, while her body remained trapped in the moment. The arrangements were made through our corporate travel office, Camille replied, each word carefully measured. She'd learned long ago that showing anger, even justified anger, would only confirm their worst assumptions about her character. The angry black woman trope was a trap she'd spent decades avoiding, even when fury was the most appropriate response. But the effort of maintaining composure was exhausting. Every interaction like this required her to split herself in two: the professional mask that smiled and remained calm, and the authentic self that raged against the injustice. The constant code switching, the perpetual performance of respectability, the endless need to be twice as good to receive half the recognition, it all took a toll that her white colleagues would never understand. I'll need to see some ID, Marissa said, her voice suddenly sharp with authority. The passport emerged from Camille's designer handbag, along with her clearance documents, papers that proved her right to be there, her right to exist in spaces of power and privilege. As she placed them on the counter, she thought about her mother, Patricia Hartley, a brilliant civil rights attorney whose career had been destroyed by fabricated ethics violations. Patricia had taught her daughter that credentials were armor, that excellence was a shield, that if you were twice as good, you might receive half the recognition. But standing there watching Marissa examine her documents with theatrical disdain, Camille understood the cruel mathematics of discrimination. No amount of achievement could fully protect her from the casual cruelty of those who saw her success as an affront to the natural order. The pain of this realization was sharp and immediate, a knife twist in her chest that made it hard to breathe. "This is really yours?" Marissa asked, her voice carrying across the terminal like a challenge. The question landed like a physical blow. In those 4 words lay the entire history of Black people in America being questioned, doubted, denied. The implicit assumption that someone like Camille, a Black woman, couldn't possibly have earned her place at the table. The passport might as well have been a fake Rolex, or a counterfeit designer bag, something a person of her color and gender might possess through deception, rather than merit. "Yes, it is," Camille replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside, she felt something breaking. Not her spirit, which had been forged in stronger fires, but something more fragile. The small part of her that still hoped for a world where her achievements would speak for themselves. The pain was multi-layered, like geological strata of suffering. At the surface was the immediate humiliation, the public questioning of her legitimacy. Beneath that lay the deeper wound of having her life's work dismissed, her achievements minimized, her very existence challenged. And deeper still was the ancestral pain, the inherited trauma of generations of Black women who had been told they didn't belong, who had been excluded, dismissed, and dehumanized. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, each frame searing itself into Camille's memory with the clarity of trauma. Marissa's hand, manicured and pale, lifting the passport with deliberate contempt. The theatrical flick of her wrist. The document, containing Camille's identity, her citizenship, her right to exist in this space, flying through the air like discarded trash. The passport hit the polished marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the terminal. It slid several feet, coming to rest near the toe of Camille's designer shoe, like a discarded piece of litter. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the weight of every person who had turned to watch, every pair of eyes that had witnessed this public humiliation. "Pick it up if it's really yours, lady," Marissa said, her voice cutting through the hush like a blade. In that moment, Camille felt the full weight of her ancestors' pain. She thought of her great-grandmother who had cleaned white women's houses while raising 7 children, always forced to enter through the back door, despite her dignity and intelligence. She thought of her grandmother who had excelled in school, but was denied admission to the state university because of her race. She thought of her mother, whose legal career had been destroyed by men who couldn't tolerate a Black woman who refused to know her place. The urge to fight back was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed for her to demand a manager, to threaten lawsuits, to use her wealth and influence to destroy this woman's career. But beneath the anger lay something more complex, a deep, soul-crushing recognition that this moment was not an aberration, but a continuation of a pattern that had defined her entire life. Standing there watching her identity document lie abandoned on the floor, Camille felt the familiar dissociation that came with racial trauma. Part of her mind detached, floating above the scene, like a witness to someone else's humiliation. This was a survival mechanism she'd developed in childhood, a way to endure experiences that threatened to shatter her sense of self. The other passengers' stares felt like physical weight. Some looked away in embarrassment, not for Marissa's behavior, but for having witnessed Camille's degradation. Others watched with the morbid fascination of people observing a car accident. A few pulled out phones, already calculating the social media value of this moment of public humiliation. The weight of representing more than herself pressed down on Camille like a physical force. She wasn't just a successful CEO being mistreated. She was a symbol. Every young Black girl who dreamed of breaking barriers would see this moment and understand that no amount of achievement could fully protect them from the casual cruelty of those who saw their success as an affront to the natural order. As Camille bent down to retrieve her passport, she felt the eyes of every person in the terminal boring into her. Each inch of her descent toward the floor was a small death, a forced genuflection to the system that had always demanded her submission. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Hold your head high, baby. They can only break your spirit if you let them." But in that moment, head bowed, reaching for the document that proved her right to exist in this space, Camille felt the crushing weight of systemic oppression. This wasn't just about one racist airport employee. This was about a society that had taught people like Marissa that someone like Camille could be humiliated with impunity. This was about the subtle and not so subtle ways that successful Black women were reminded that their achievements were temporary, their presence merely tolerated. The passport felt heavier than it should have, as she straightened up her movements, deliberate and controlled. She could feel the fractures in her composure, the way this moment was reshaping something fundamental inside her. The successful businesswoman, the confident CEO, the woman who had conquered boardrooms and built empires, all of that felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible, each word requiring tremendous effort. The phrase was a masterpiece of code-switching a way of maintaining dignity while acknowledging the power dynamic that had just been so brutally demonstrated. The irony was not lost on her. She was thanking the person who had just humiliated her, following the script that society had written for people like her. Be grateful for whatever treatment you receive. Don't make a scene. Don't confirm their worst assumptions about your character. The internal conflict was excruciating. The part of her that wanted to fight warring with the part that had been trained to survive through accommodation. As she placed the passport back on the counter, Camille felt the familiar splitting that came with racial trauma. Part of her mind cataloged the legal implications, the potential lawsuits, the strategic opportunities this moment might create. But another part, the part that remembered being 14 years old and having a guidance counselor suggest she might be happier in vocational training rather than college prep, felt the old wounds reopening. The additional verification process that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic sadism. Each form, each question, each suspicious glance was designed to underscore her otherness, her questionable right to be there. Camille endured it all with the grace of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required swallowing indignities that would choke a lesser person. But the pain was cumulative, each new humiliation adding to the weight she carried. The security guard who approached with hand-on weapon as if she posed a threat, the manager who spoke to her in the slow, condescending tone reserved for children and the mentally impaired. The other passengers who whispered and pointed their conversations, a constant reminder of her status as spectacle rather than person. The physical symptoms of trauma were unmistakable: the rapid heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the tremor in her hands that she fought to control. But beneath the physiological responses lay something deeper: the spiritual wound of having her humanity questioned, her dignity, assaulted her very existence, challenged in the most public way possible. Even as she maintained her composure, something fundamental was shifting inside her. The humiliation was transforming into something else. Not just anger, but a crystalline clarity about the nature of the world she operated in. Every whispered conversation, every skeptical glance, every moment of having her credentials questioned had led to this moment of absolute clarity about the forces arrayed against her. The security check that followed felt like a violation, layered upon violation. Being pulled aside for random screening, having her personal items examined with suspicious thoroughness, enduring the barely concealed hostility of security personnel who had clearly been briefed about the difficult passenger. Each moment added another layer to the trauma that was reshaping her understanding of her place in the world. The TSA agents' hands were rough as they searched her belongings, each touch a violation of her privacy and dignity. The questions came in rapid succession. What's the purpose of your trip? Who are you meeting? How can you afford to travel this way? Each query was loaded with suspicion, with the assumption that someone like her had no legitimate reason to be in spaces of privilege. Camille answered each question with the patience of someone who had learned that cooperation was the fastest path through the gauntlet of discrimination. But inside she felt herself fragmenting, parts of her psyche retreating to safe spaces, while her body endured the ongoing assault on her dignity. The other passengers in the security line watched with the mixture of fascination and discomfort that characterized most white people's relationship with black pain. Some looked sympathetic, but did nothing to intervene. Others seemed to enjoy the spectacle, their expressions revealing the ugly satisfaction that came from seeing a successful black woman brought low. As she finally cleared security and made her way to the VIP lounge, Camille caught her reflection in a mirror. The face looking back at her was composed, professional, successful. But the eyes told a different story. They held the weight of every slight, every dismissal, every moment of having to prove her right to exist in spaces of power and privilege. The lounge was quiet, filled with the soft murmur of important people conducting important business. Camille took a seat in a corner where she could observe without being observed, her mind processing the morning's events with the analytical precision that had made her a successful CEO. But beneath the analysis lay something more primal, a pain that went beyond the personal to touch something ancestral and deep. She thought about the young black girl who had recognized her in the airport. Jasmine with her bright eyes and dreams of changing the world through technology. What would that child think if she knew how the world still treated successful black women? What would it do to her dreams to understand that no amount of achievement could fully shield her from the casual cruelty of those who saw her success as an affront? The thought of Jasmine's innocence being destroyed by the reality of discrimination was almost unbearable. Camille had spent her career believing that her success could be a shield for the next generation, that her achievements could open doors that had been closed to her. But this morning had revealed the limits of that protection, the ways in which the system adapted to maintain its hierarchies, even in the face of individual success. The phone calls that followed, from her assistant, from board members, from the media, each one adding another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. Everyone wanted to know how she would respond, what her strategy would be, whether she would fight back or accept the humiliation with grace. But none of them understood that this wasn't just about strategy or public relations. This was about the fundamental question of her right to exist in spaces of power without having to constantly justify her presence. "Camille, are you all right?" The voice belonged to Nia, her assistant and closest confidant. Even through the phone, Camille could hear the concern, the barely contained rage on her behalf. "I'm fine," Camille replied automatically, the lie coming so easily that it frightened her. She had spent decades perfecting the art of being fine in situations that would have broken other people. But the cost of that strength was beginning to show the cracks in her armor, spreading with each new assault on her dignity. "No, you're not," Nia said firmly. "I saw the video. Someone recorded the whole thing. It's already going viral." The words hit Camille like a physical blow. Her moment of private humiliation had become public entertainment, her pain transformed into content for social media consumption. As the morning progressed, Camille felt the familiar weight of representing more than herself. She wasn't just a CEO who had been mistreated. She was a symbol of every black woman who had ever been told she didn't belong, every person of color who had achieved success only to be reminded that their achievements were conditional, their presence merely tolerated. The text messages from unknown numbers began arriving within hours, some supportive, others hostile, all of them treating her trauma as public property. The anonymous threats, the racial slurs, the suggestions that she should be grateful for whatever treatment she received. Each message was a reminder that her pain was not just personal, but political, not just individual, but systemic. But perhaps the most painful messages came from other successful black women who reached out to share their own stories of similar humiliation. the Fortune 500 CEO who had been asked to show ID at her own company's board meeting, the federal judge who had been questioned about her right to be in the judicial parking garage, the university president who had been mistaken for catering staff at her own inauguration. Each story was a reminder that success was not armor against discrimination, that achievement was not a shield against the casual cruelty of those who saw Black excellence as an aberration to be corrected rather than celebrated. The weight of these shared experiences pressed down on Camille like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to think hard, to maintain the composure that had carried her through decades of professional success. The isolation was perhaps the most painful aspect of the experience. Despite being surrounded by people, colleagues, assistants, business partners, Camille felt utterly alone in her pain. They could sympathize, they could offer support, but they couldn't truly understand the depth of the wound that had been inflicted the way it connected to every other moment of discrimination she had endured. As she sat in the VIP lounge, watching the news coverage of her humiliation spread across social media, Camille felt the familiar dissociation that came with racial trauma. Part of her mind observed the strategic implications, the potential opportunities, the ways this moment might be leveraged for positive change. But another part, the part that remembered being a foster child who dreamed of changing the world, felt the old wounds reopening with fresh intensity. The boarding call for her flight came as a relief, a chance to escape the stares and whispers, the cell phone cameras and social media posts. But even as she walked toward the gate, Camille knew that there would be no real escape from this moment. It would follow her into every boardroom, every negotiation, every public appearance. She would forever be the CEO who had her passport thrown on the floor, the successful Black woman who had been publicly humiliated despite her achievements. The private jet offered temporary sanctuary, its luxury a stark contrast to the morning's degradation. But even surrounded by leather seats and crystal glasses, Camille could not escape the fundamental truth that this experience had revealed that no amount of success could fully protect her from the poison of prejudice, that her achievements would always be viewed through the lens of her race and gender, that she would forever be an outsider in spaces of power despite having built her own empire. The flight attendant, a young Black woman with kind eyes, approached with obvious concern. "Ms. Hartley, I saw what happened at the airport. I'm so sorry you had to endure that." The unexpected kindness was almost Camille's undoing the first genuine human connection she had experienced since the morning's trauma. "Thank you," Camille replied, her voice barely steady. It's not the first time." The admission felt dangerous, a crack in the armor she had spent decades building. But there was something liberating about acknowledging the reality of her experience, about admitting that the pain was real and ongoing. As the plane lifted off, carrying her toward what should have been the triumph of her career, Camille stared out the window at the city below. Each light represented a life, a story, a struggle. How many of those lights belonged to people who had experienced similar humiliation? How many dreams had been deferred or destroyed by the casual cruelty of those who saw diversity as a threat rather than a strength? The merger documents spread across her lap seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the weight of the morning's events. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about something fundamental. The right to exist in spaces of power without having to constantly justify that existence, the right to be treated with basic human dignity regardless of race or gender, the right to have achievements judged on their merits rather than through the distorting lens of prejudice. The pain of discrimination was not just emotional, but physical, a constant tension that lived in her shoulders, a knot in her stomach that never fully disappeared. It was the exhaustion of being hypervigilant, of constantly monitoring her behavior to ensure she didn't confirm anyone's worst assumptions. It was the fatigue of being a representative of her entire race, carrying the weight of every success and failure, as if they reflected on all black women, rather than just herself. As the plane soared through the clouds, Camille felt the familiar splitting that came with racial trauma. Part of her mind was already calculating her response, planning her strategy, preparing for the battles ahead. But another part, the part that remembered being a child who dreamed of a world where merit mattered more than melanin, grieved for the innocence that had been lost not just that morning, but over decades of similar experiences. The recognition that this moment would define her, that she would forever be the CEO who had her passport thrown on the floor, felt like a death of sorts. Not the death of her career or her achievements, but the death of the hope that someday, somewhere, her success would be enough to shield her from the casual cruelty of those who saw her as an interloper in spaces of power. But even as she grieved, Camille felt something else stirring. Not just anger, but a crystalline clarity about the nature of the world she operated in and her responsibility to change it. The humiliation had been public, witnessed by hundreds of people and thousands more through social media. But perhaps that visibility could be transformed into something powerful, something that would ensure that other young black women would not have to endure similar degradation. The weight of discrimination was not just personal, but generational, passed down through families and communities like a genetic inheritance. Her great-grandmother's humiliation at the hands of white employers, her grandmother's exclusion from educational opportunities, her mother's professional destruction. All of it had led to this moment, this test of whether the cycle could be broken or would continue into the next generation. As the plane began its descent toward her destination, Camille felt the familiar armor of professionalism settling back into place. But beneath the composed exterior, the pain remained. Not just from that morning's humiliation, but from decades of similar experiences, from the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent navigating spaces where her presence was questioned, her achievements doubted her, humanity denied. The merger meeting awaited the culmination of years of work and planning. But now it carried additional weight, not just as a business transaction, but as a statement about power, about who gets to sit at the table and who gets to determine the terms of engagement. The passport incident had been intended to diminish her, to remind her of her place in the hierarchy of power. Instead, it had crystallized her understanding of the forces arrayed against her and strengthened her resolve to not just succeed, but to transform the very nature of success itself. The pain of discrimination was real, immediate, and ongoing. But it was also transformative, a fire that could either destroy or forge something stronger than what came before. As Camille prepared to face the day's challenges, she carried not just the weight of her personal trauma, but the hopes and dreams of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in spaces of power. The passport might have been thrown on the floor, but she was still standing, still fighting, still determined to change the world one boardroom at a time. The scars would remain invisible to most, but forever present in the way she moved through the world. Every airport, every check-in counter, every interaction with authority would carry the echo of this moment. But the scars were also armor-proof of her resilience, evidence of her refusal to be broken by the cruelty of those who saw her success as an affront to the natural order. In the end, the pain of discrimination was both wound and weapon trauma and transformation. It was the tax levied on those who dared to succeed in spaces not meant for them, the price paid for breaking barriers and challenging assumptions. But it was also the fuel that powered change, the raw material from which justice was forged. As Camille stepped off the plane and into the next chapter of her story, she carried with her the weight of every insult, every slight, every moment of having her humanity questioned. But she also carried the strength of every ancestor who had endured similar treatment, the hope of every young person who saw in her success a vision of their own possibilities, and the determination to ensure that the passport thrown on the floor would become the foundation for a new world where such humiliation was no longer possible. The pain would never fully disappear, but it would be transformed, channeled into something greater than revenge or bitterness. It would become the driving force behind changes that would echo through generations, ensuring that the next young black girl who dreamed of changing the world would face fewer barriers, encounter less cruelty, and find more allies in her journey toward success. The discrimination she had endured was not just personal, but systemic, not just individual, but institutional. And the response would be equally comprehensive, equally transformative, equally enduring. The passport on the floor was just the beginning.